Ladies and gentlemen, this is a program on constitutional government and also the government department's political theory colloquium. And our guest today is Ronna Burger, PhD, as it says on her website. So yes, sure.
In case anyone doubts.
Right, yeah, no, don't doubt. You mustn't doubt. And this happened, I've forgotten the year, but it's from the new school. Long time ago, from the New School of Social Research in New York City. And she's a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Tulane University and a professor of Jewish Studies, and you're the director of the Religious Studies minor.
Which I just invented to get to teach this course.
Well, that's good, all right. So that's wonderful. And now, has she written books? Yes. The answer is yes. So she's written a book on the Phaedrus, Plato's Phaedrus, Defense of a Philosophic Art of Writing, the Phaedo, a Platonic labyrinth, and more recently we're getting to Aristotle's dialogue with Socrates on the Nicomachean Ethics, so a book on Aristotle's ethics, and a shorter thing on a big book on Plato's Euthyphro from the Siemens Foundation. And she's the editor of The Eccentric Core, which has recently come out, which is a collection of studies on the thought of Seth Benedetto, with whom she studied, and was always great friends. And together with and the title of her contribution to this, the Eccentric Core, is The Erotic and the Thumatic Soul. So her topic today is the fall from our ancient nature. It's on Plato's Aristophanic speech on Eros and the biblical story of Adam and Eve. After she speaks, there will be a short response from Jacob Balafia, a graduate student at Harvard, and then, of course, questions from the audience. Now, there'll be a slight pause.
She said. Just put this in my pocket. Hi everyone, can you hear me? I don't think this interferes. Welcome, wonderful crowd. I don't know what it's usually like, but Thursday afternoon, thank you all for coming. This paper I want to sort of set. First of all, there's a handout with its front and back, and this will be, I think, much more useful to you probably after the afternoon, like later. I hope people will be inspired to look at some of these things and think about it some more. So I think some of the important passages I'm referring to are on the handout. And you can see from the handout that this talk I want to do is in 5 sections. And I hope maybe it'll help you follow me a little to see that. So, and as you see from the title, I'm really trying to think out some kind of the relationship between this, biblical text and Plato. And it's, I first discovered this many years ago. I was so excited when I was reading Genesis, and I'm thinking, that sounds exactly like, to me, it sounds so much like Aristophanes' speech on Eros in the Symposium. Wow, I was so proud of myself for this amazing discovery. And then I found out that I was scooped by about 2,000 years. That this has been known or seen in a way, since the two traditions came together, like usually people would say Philo in the 1st century CE. So, unfortunately, I can't claim total originality for this. And the other thing, just to sort of let you see in advance where I'm going with this, what originally attracted me, or what I had seen at first, was, the character of the androgynous human being in Symposium as something similar to Adam in the Bible. But only later did I realize that the whole plot of the two texts, there's a story to that subject, and the whole story is also resonant in, I think, really very illuminating ways. So that's what I'm trying to do. And there's a lot packed in. You can even stop me if you want to in the middle of something somewhere. Okay, so I just want to start with a couple remarks about 2 roots of the Western tradition, which I think all of you know, so I won't belabor. If Jerusalem and Athens are the 2 roots of the Western tradition, on what basis can we explore that duality? I thought one way might be provided if there were a text that's close enough in two texts, close enough in outline, so that any salient differences might be potentially illuminating. And that does seem to be the case with these two writings. Of course, neither was known to the other originally. But there is, I think, a striking resonance. And as you see, one is the speech on Eros that Plato puts into the mouth of the comic poet Aristophanes in the Symposium, and the other, the account of man and woman formed out of the original human being in the book of Genesis. The resonance is that both tell the story of a fall. They set out to explain human life as we know it by appealing to an original state that was completely different in kind and that's now lost to us. And I am extremely interested in that strategy of argument. So if we want, I would be happy to come back to that later. I think it's a very general tool of arguing that's quite interesting to me. I'm going to maybe call it a genetic account. More specifically, both of these writings present our condition as the result of divine punishment for a criminal deed by our ancestors. In each account, the primordial human being is complete and a whole, and the deity who divides it in two makes every subsequent individual only a fragmented, partial being, driven by the desire to restore its original wholeness. The differences in plot and content that emerge from this common ground raise, I think, a number of intriguing questions about these works as potentially representative of Jerusalem and Athens. Some of these questions, just a few, are the conception of the primary human being and how that compares with the derivative one that we all are, the purpose of the God who splits that original whole into two, and especially the motivation for transgressing the boundaries separating human from divine, and how that act is evaluated in these two texts. So those are the big questions I'm after. Okay, let me start with this section on, I'm calling it Assault on the Heavens and the Emergence of Eros. This is Aristophanes' speech. Aristophanes sets out to explain and I have a kind of summary. I wasn't sure if anybody had read this paper in advance or not, but it's kind of the summary of the salient points are on your handout. Aristophanes sets out to explain the power of Eros as the most philanthropic god, the physician concerned with those ills of the human condition, which if they could be healed, would lead to the greatest happiness. But whatever Eros, the healing god, may be able to accomplish, Eros, the passion, proves to be the disease itself from which we are suffering. And Aristophanes suggests it is incurable. This disease is the product of that divine punishment that brought about the fall from our ancient nature. That phrase I'm taking directly from Aristophanes. In its primordial form, this is the Platonic eidos, the human being was, you all know this, a spherical body with 4 legs and 4 arms, and it moved by doing cartwheels and rolling around, 2 sets of faces facing in opposite directions, 2 sets of genitals it needed, and it's a rather quite a hilarious picture of these spherical beings. As this shape attests, we were in the image of the cosmic gods, belonging to 3 sorts. Those descending from the sun, 2 males. Those from the earth were 2 females. And the offspring of the moon were androgynous, male and female. Our kinship with the cosmic gods might have led, I think Plato suggests this, might have led to the characterization of humans as essentially theoretical beings who would find their fulfillment in contemplation of the cosmos as an ordered whole. But that is not the understanding he attributes to the comic poet. Aristophanes does speak of the primordial humans having, quote, big thoughts, literally, calls it great thoughts. But what he means by this is a great ambition driven by pride. It was displayed in their attempt to mount to the heavens, overstepping the limits separating them from the Olympian gods. Zeus, of course, is disturbed by this threat to his power, but initially at a loss. If human beings were simply annihilated, there would be no one left to pay honor to the gods. He soon hits upon a strategy. I think it's a strategy Machiavelli would love. So here's this Zeusian Machiavellian strategy. If each human being were split in 2, they would be totally weakened, yet at the same time much more plentiful as worshippers. And then Zeus threatens, if If human pride makes it necessary, he could split the half-beings once more, and each of us would be only a profile, hopping around on one leg. Aristophanes gives a comic coloring to his portrait of a tyrant god. Before the quartering of human beings becomes necessary, though, Zeus finds another expedient. He orders Apollo to turn the faces of the half-beings toward the cut side, so the sight of the punishment would serve to induce moderation. The comic contingency of our human shape. He loves thinking about the wrinkled skin around the belly button where they had to sew it together once it was split. This comic shape is to be a painful reminder of the loss of our original completeness, with the possibility always on the horizon of further fragmentation and alienation from the whole self. Human beings whose ancient nature was in the image of the cosmic gods are cut down to size, literally, by the anthropomorphic Olympians, the gods of the city who impose the constraints of the law. Eros, as Aristophanes presents it, is not a primary human passion. It is only the derivative product of punishment for the fundamental human impulse, the resistance to authority, or maybe the desire not to be ruled. The punishment for that impulse produces the partial beings, and Eros arises then as the longing of each to restore their completeness by fusing together with the other half. The force of this desire at first proved so powerful that no practical needs could compete, and human beings began to perish. Zeus, this time in pity, although I'm wondering if he's still motivated by wanting to preserve his worshippers, comes up with another plan. By moving the genitals around to the front side, because remember the two halves are moving the things around that way, he could he would give human beings some respite from their unfulfilled longing. A man could unite with a woman and generate offspring, thus providing for preservation of the species. And if a man came together with another man, by the way, Aristophanes says nothing about a woman with a woman. I don't guess he doesn't claim to know anything about that. There would be, he says, at least a moment of satisfaction, making survival possible. Aristophanes' description of the search for our other half captures what is perhaps, I think, the deepest belief that informs our erotic experience. The belief in the uniqueness of the beloved, who is destined for us and would complete us. Of course, he does note in passing how upon the death of one half, the other would go seeking any half of a whole woman or a whole man. What his account really makes intelligible is not our attraction to a unique individual, but only a typology of three classes. I guess what we call sexual orientation. And he assigns his own evaluative ranking. The original androgynous class gives rise to man and woman, who make up Aristophanes' charges most of the adulterers and adulteresses. This bothered me for a long time. Why does he say that? There's no argument, there's no justification for it. And so it seems to be just his own prejudice. But as I think about it, this is at least my one suggestion. If Eros is the longing to restore the whole prior to the division by the punitive gods of the city, the passion must be essentially antinomian. But marriage legitimates love, yokes it to the needs of family and society. So the paradigm of heterosexual erotic relations would have to be found outside of that institution. I think maybe that's what he's getting at. Aristophanes assigns the highest place in the rank order of erotic classes to the all-male pairs, whose manly nature leads them to become men active in the city. I reread some of Harvey's manliness with this paragraph. The political life is the closest fallen human beings come to the assault on the heavens by the original, complete humans. The Aristophanic count, then, does admit a kind of aspiration, a vertical dimension in human life, but it is not an erotic aspiration. Eros is a purely horizontal relationship. That is connected with another feature. Each member of the Aristophanic pair is both lover and beloved of the other, of course, right? Two halves. And they believe they need nothing but each other. The reciprocity, this might not have as much meaning for people who don't have Plato and Aristotle in mind, but Plato and Aristotle would, I think, consistently only use that as a characterization of friendship. Friendship or philia is reciprocal. You can't be the friend of the other guy unless he's your friend. Two friends, and they complete each other in a reciprocal way. But they deny, typically, that Eros is of that sort. The question of reciprocity looms very large in their account of Eros, whether the beloved would ever return. So the consequence of this is that Aristophanic lovers, though, do not aspire in and through Eros to anything higher than union with one another. I'll ask you later if this makes sense to you. But okay. An Aristophanic lover who is also the beloved could not suffer from unrequited love. Yet Eros, on Aristophanes' account, is hardly a state of fulfillment. His lovers are mystified by the elusive experience. They know they're seeking something more than the pleasures of sex, but as Aristophanes puts it, the soul only darkly divines what is being sought. Aristophanes recalls Homer's story of the adulterous lovers, Ares and Aphrodite, caught in the net of Hephaestus, Odyssey 8. Boy, if you go back to that, that's a very rich and interesting story too. Aristophanes imagines, if the forger god came to any two lovers and asked them, "What do you want?" they would be utterly perplexed. We don't know what we want, really. But if he offered the possibility of living a single life and dying a single death, fused eternally in Hades, no one would refuse. Eros, Aristophanes concludes, and this is his definition, is the desire and pursuit of the whole. Plato has him speak words that could be given a Platonic reading. That very formula could have a Platonic interpretation. But the whole that the poet has in mind is just the original self that each individual longs for, which he assumes he has a right to restore, since it is what he once was. Of course, permanent reunification with our missing half would be possible, Aristophanes admits, in death alone. Or even more precisely, a death that could be shared by two lovers, followed by continued existence as one in Hades. The longing that defines the human condition is a wound that cannot be healed. And if it could, it would only destroy the individuality Eros was meant to restore. Aristophanes began with that amusing image of cartwheeling spherical human beings, back-to-back doubles, whose division produced our laughable human shape. But what began as a comic portrait of fallen humans, with Eros as our defining passion, seems to have ended on a tragic note. I want to turn now and ask whether the biblical counterpart is another comic tragedy, or is it something else altogether? So I'm going on now to my next section, Man, Woman, and the Primordial Adam. I'm starting with a translation of the well-known line from Genesis 1:27 in a translation by Everett Fox. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. He's got quite a poetic translation of the Hebrew Bible, and it's sometimes strained, I think, but this line he got it, and I don't think anyone else got it quite right. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God did he create it. Male and female did he create them. And that's the line, right? It's so mysterious how it moves from it to them, and such a puzzle in that one verse. And I think he captured that. The Adam of Genesis 1, created by God in his own image, at the pinnacle of the cosmic whole, is it, but also them. A being that either abstracts from the difference between male and female, or comprehends both. Such a being, rabbinic commentators reasoned, would have to be one whole with two aspects or parts. You have that there, but let me get back to that in a minute when it really comes in. We'll look at that in a minute. I think it's rather remarkable how concrete they were about it. It is striking that this duality of Adam is described immediately after God exhorts, "Let us make Adam in our image, after our likeness." That happens to be the first biblical passage Maimonides cites in the opening chapter of the Guide of the Perplexed. It's a fitting starting point for the challenge he faces of explaining biblical language that is incompatible with the truth, as reason or science recognizes it, of the perfect non-corporeality and unity of God. Really quite a challenge. He plunges in. The term image, Maimonides insists, has nothing to do with physical looks. Of course, if you look up his citations, he gives you ones that show that it does, but we'll put that aside. That's another paper. It refers, he says, to the natural form, the essence, the TSD, the what it is of a being. That which makes the human being what it is, in the image of God, is what distinguishes human from beast, and that is the faculty of intellect. Adam, in the image and likeness of God, is the human as essentially mind. Both God and his human creature look very different when the next chapter of Genesis starts over again. Leaving behind the cosmic perspective, it directs all its concerns to the central phenomena of human life. The God of the universe, Elohim, from chapter 1, who created the primordial Adam in his own image, is replaced by Yahweh, a potter who molds Adam from the dust of the earth, Adamah, so this Adam is earthy, and breathes life into his nostrils. The human as essentially mind is now replaced by a concrete creature of body and soul. This Adam is to live in a garden with all his needs supplied, filled with every tree pleasant to sight and good for food. We'll need that soon, but I just note these two things. With only one restriction imposed on him, he is forbidden to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, that restriction could be understood as just a natural feature of the human life that belongs to the Garden of Eden. The beings who live in the Garden of Eden could not have knowledge of good and evil. It wouldn't fit. And by the way, I have a little footnote here if anyone wants to think about this. The place to look to sort of confirm that point, I think, is the myth of Plato's Statesman. It's he has a cosmic myth and two epics and so on. And then one epic under the rule of God, providential, it's almost like paraphrasing the Garden of Eden. Fruit is hanging from the trees and so on. No needs, total dependence, no arts, and so on. We can talk about that another time. But that, let me introduce two terms here. I'm going to call that sort of description I just gave an eidetic account, an account of the form, or eidos. This is what it means to live in a Garden of Eden. In contrast with a genetic account, which tells you that there was once a time. The genetic account in Genesis is presented as God's imposition of his authoritative will, the most fundamental prohibition on human beings. So what might have been taken as just a description of this kind of life is presented as a prohibition, a command. So to violate it is a crime. Of course, the attention God draws to the forbidden fruit of knowledge almost inevitably invites violation. As soon as he issues this prohibition, God for the first time finds something not good, Adam being alone. What God sees as not good is presumably the incompleteness of this solitary creature and his need of another. Or, and here comes it's going to sound like a slightly heretical point, I'm not sure in the end it is. Or I wonder if it's possible that the contrary notion is lurking here, and the biblical God, like Aristophanes' Zeus, what he finds not good is the completeness and self-sufficiency of the original human being. That is an idea that I haven't seen anywhere, maybe for good reasons. But I have an argument for it and couldn't get back to it. To correct the problem, in any case, God forms all the other animals out of the ground, Adamah, Adam's element. But his only response is to bestow names on them, a mark of his dominion. The companion who could correct the solitude of Adam is an other that must be brought into being not by an addition, but by a separation from him. So plunged into a deep sleep, I think a kind of death, I think it's meant to be a kind of death, Adam will awaken with a permanent alteration of his being. He is no longer a whole after God forms woman out of his rib, or one side of his body, as Maimonides notes with an appeal to the authority of the Talmudic writers on the meaning of the term rib. That is in your handout, I think. It's so remarkable, isn't it? I don't think I want to necessarily read the whole thing now, but they go, when God created Adam, he created him hermaphrodite, as it said, male and female he created them and called them Adam. He made Adam with 2 fronts, then sawed him in half and gave him 2 backs. Someone objected and said, doesn't the scripture say he took one of the ribs? And the other rabbi replies, yeah, that can mean one of his sides. And he quotes this phrase, a side of the tabernacle, a rib of the tabernacle. So, I haven't demonstrated, I haven't proven, you might know, Jacob. I don't know if they did know the Aristophanes speech. Did they?
Well,
it seems that
we can talk about
yeah,
it.
Okay.
It must be. Yeah.
It must be. But they're sort of willing to come right out and make this Adam the hermaphrodite. Okay. Once the human being has been split into 2, Adam, of course, immediately recognizes the other formed from his side as his own. Flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. And by the way, that's where Philo, in his commentary, where I got the understanding that he knew this, Philo then said, the 2 halves of a whole come together. It's in your handout. He clearly is seeing that line in light of the Aristophanes speech in the Symposium. Adam gives her the name woman, Isha in Hebrew, because she came from man, ish. Same word, just feminine ending. Woman must be derivative, but man too appears here for the first time. The word man, it's just like Greek. There's a different word from human than for male human. So this is the first time we've heard man simultaneous with woman. Woman only makes explicit what must be true of her partner as well. Each half is as partial as the other, neither identical with the whole from which they have been formed. And I think they are more or less equals. We can come back to that later. God's splitting of Adam into man and woman is a unique event, but at this moment the narrative is interrupted to draw from it a universal principle. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Genesis 2:24. For the New Testament writers, this passage supplies the deep biblical foundation for the new teaching Jesus brings prohibiting divorce. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, Jesus characterizes marriage by citing Genesis 2. They twain shall be one flesh. One neat little thing I discovered was that is from the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, because twain is not in the Hebrew Bible. There's no twain. They're all going to be polygamists in Genesis. So it's, they had to get that from the Septuagint. And Jesus appeals, it seems, to God's original creation as the archetype when he concludes, what therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. Mark and Matthew. Real interesting things also about why a remarriage of either partner would be considered adultery, which I learned from the scholar not well enough known David Dauba. And if anyone's interested, we can come back to that later too, I hope. He has some interesting reflections on that. Okay. Man and woman becoming one flesh is not really a restoration of the complete human, but more a compensation for its loss, a corporeal displacement of the primordial Adam in the image of God. By the end of the 2nd chapter of Genesis, man and woman stand over against each other as fragments of a whole, although they do not understand themselves this way. They are naked but not ashamed. The self-awareness they lack, which comes with the awareness of the other, requires disobedience of God. That defiant deed will be undertaken not as an Aristophanes account by the self-sufficient complete human, but rather by the partial one, more precisely woman. Man who was left over from the original human once Adam was split in two, cleaves to his wife to recover that whole. Woman apparently seeks something beyond that. I'm going on to my next section now, the prohibition against knowledge of good and evil. This is some thoughts about Genesis 3. The story of the primeval deed of disobedience begins with a question, the first in the Bible. It is raised by a talking serpent, a very unusual kind of figure in the Hebrew Bible. There really isn't that much mythological creatures like this. Of all beasts in the field, we are told, the most subtle or clever. I got to give you the Hebrew, you'll see why in a second. Arum, the most subtle or clever, cunning. I like translation. The prior chapter just ended with the statement that man and woman were not ashamed, though naked, arumim. This is a pun. It's just the plural of the same, cognate of the same. What is the meaning of this pun? I have some ideas. I'm open and interested in anything you think. I think it's a really neat puzzle, and I only operate on the assumption that it's deliberate, but what does it mean? I'm thinking something along these lines. Serpentine cunning. Serpentine cunning is a rejection of law or convention, and that is somehow a distorted mirror of naked innocence. That's all I can come up with, but I'm curious with them. Now this serpent appears out of nowhere, addresses the woman alone, and vanishes as soon as she contemplates the forbidden fruit through her own eyes. The dialogue of the woman with this talking serpent certainly looks like an externalized representation of an inner debate with herself. The serpent taunts the woman with an overly harsh version of God's prohibition. Were you not forbidden to eat from any tree in the garden? Presumably intending with this exaggerated restriction to arouse her resentment against a God who would make mere survival impossible. She corrects him, but only with her own overstatement. They've been forbidden even to touch the fruit, let alone consume it. I'm also kind of curious and wondering what that difference means. Not even to touch this knowledge, let alone absorb it and have it become one. She speaks, moreover, of the tree in the middle of the garden, apparently unable to differentiate the tree of life from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Her false assumption, I think, in fact, prepares for the conclusion of the story, where the two trees prove to be so intertwined that the attainment of the forbidden fruit of knowledge requires blocking the way to the tree of life. On the day you eat of that fruit, God warned Adam, you shall surely die. The human possession of knowledge of good and evil, one might take this to mean, has an essential connection with the condition of mortality. So that's my eidetic account, right? Possessing knowledge of evil is impossible without death as a part of the human condition. But in our biblical genetic account, once the acquisition of that knowledge is construed as a crime, death is a punishment. It's translated into crime and punishment. The serpent refuses to admit this connection. He assures the woman that God was only concealing from humans the reward for eating this fruit. Their eyes will be opened and they will become like gods. Knowledge of good and evil is sufficient for divinity, and it is a jealous God whose will alone prevents humans from sharing in it. Indeed, humans created in the image of God might reasonably be entitled to restore their original condition. Looking up at the tree after her exchange with the serpent, the woman sees three features. This is a little bit complicated, but very concrete. I don't think you'll follow me. And I think I have the passages there on the handout. She sees three features: fruit good for food, a delight to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. The first two were precisely the characteristics originally attributed to all the trees in the garden in Genesis 2. Maimonides, this is who I learned this from, Maimonides, commenting on this passage in the second chapter of the Guide, refers to the perception of just these two features, fruit good to eat and a delight to the eyes. And as a result, he blames, seems to on the surface, he blames the fall of man on carnal appetite and imagination. Some good interpretation, good to eat and delight to the eyes. However, he leaves out the third feature that the woman sees on her own, which is unique to the fruit of this tree. So, either he lost his copy of Genesis 3 or he nodded, but impossible. He leaves out the feature that she sees on her own. This fruit is desirable for wisdom. By this conspicuous omission, Maimonides draws our attention to the Bible's indication of the profound challenge to God's rule, not carnal appetite, but the desire by human beings to acquire wisdom on their own. The serpent's attempt to arouse the woman's resentment against the willful restriction of a jealous God might sound like the voice of Platonic's spiritedness. You all know Thumos, probably, right? Sounds a lot like that to me. What moves the woman, though, when she perceives the fruit through her own eyes, is the desire for wisdom. So you can see I'm pushing Eve as philosopher. The woman reaches out for the fruit and eats it, passes it to her husband, who without a word eats of it himself. Now, the woman's dialogue with the serpent opened up a window into her mind. We see a lot of her psychology. The man's motivation is opaque. Yet only when both have eaten are their eyes open together, just as the serpent predicted. The first mark of the knowledge they acquire is the experience of shame, and they cover themselves with fig leaves. Shame motivates covering naked human nature with the clothing of law or convention. I think that's an almost ubiquitous image of law or convention clothing, but we can come back to that later. Let's talk about that. The difference naked man and woman perceive in their condition shows up now as a sign of defectiveness, measured against the whole being from which they originated. To be man or woman is to fall short of the human as such in the image of God. I'm thinking that this shame goes very deep. It's what we are in our fragmented being is the source. While covering themselves from each other's view, man and woman hear God's voice, wafting through the garden. It's an amazing image. Walking in the cool of day in the garden, God's voice wafting through. And they conceal themselves from God. When God calls out to Adam, "Where art thou?" he responds, "I heard your voice and was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." The shame man and woman have before each other brings with it fear before God. Shame and fear together issue in the transformed human condition. God now tests Adam. Who told you you were naked? The man shifts the blame understandably on the woman, or more precisely, on the woman, God, whom you gave me. You can't blame him, right? She in turn passes the blame on to the serpent, and God seems to concur. He imposes a curse on the serpent, which makes its natural motion, its eidos, slithering on its belly in the dust, into the vivid image of punishment for a crime. God adds another rather mysterious announcement of an eternal enmity between the seed of the serpent and that of the woman. I don't know quite what to make of that, but I think, again, the serpent looks like some projection of a feature in the complex nature of woman from which she can never be freed. Man and woman, unlike the serpent, are not themselves cursed, but they are punished. God's initial plan, supposedly, or at least his first revision after the original solitary Adam, was for a pair of innocent creatures to dwell immortally in the ease of the garden. That plan is replaced by a new one. Preservation of the species, death, preservation of the species through sexual reproduction. And following the pattern that runs through the whole biblical account, a natural function, the pain of childbirth, is explained as a matter of divine punishment, a reminder through the ages of the first woman's deed of disobedience. One further consequence for woman goes beyond the biological nature. Your desire, God announces, will be unto your husband, and he shall rule over you. I believe that's the first time we hear of rule, ruler and ruled. At least in the human realm, the first relation of ruler and ruled is man over woman. Once the primordial atom was divided, man was drawn to woman to restore the original whole. What attracted her, on the other hand, was the possibility of becoming like God by obtaining knowledge of good and evil. Whether it was spirited resistance against authority, or a striving for wisdom, or both woven together that motivated her disobedience, woman's desire must be rechanneled. Directed now toward her husband, it is meant to assure her subordination to man's rule. It works pretty well. Turning finally to the man, God issues a curse not on Adam, but for his sake on the Adamah, the ground. Laboring over the unyielding earth is to be a constant reminder that man is dust and will return to dust. Work, like childbirth, is a sign of mortality. Adam says nothing in response. He reverts instead to his activity as name giver and bestows on woman for the first time a proper name, Eve, Hava in Greek, which is living. He said, because she is the mother of all the living. The woman's effort to achieve likeness to God through the acquisition of knowledge and good and evil has been replaced by her role in the transmission of life. Philosopher, I would say, replaced by life-giver. God's encounter with Adam and Eve comes to an end with a very puzzling gesture. This is one of the things I have not answered to my satisfaction. He clothes them in garments of animal skins he has produced for them, which I gather requires killing an animal. No animals have been killed yet. There's no carnivorous life yet. Once their eyes were opened after eating the forbidden fruit, the first action of man and woman was to cover themselves with fig leaves. But apparently humans clothing themselves is not sufficient. God assumes this responsibility. I take it then the clothing he provides must represent the divine law. Why then is the image animal skins, which would give human beings the appearance of beasts? I'm really stuck on that puzzle. If anyone has any thoughts, please convey them to me. The transformed human condition brought about by the possession of knowledge of good and evil simply illustrates what it means to live no longer in childlike innocence. But at the conclusion of the story, expulsion from the Garden of Eden is presented once again as divine punishment for the human deed of disobedience. More precisely, it is a preventive policy, I think, in light of that deed. Adam, God announces in the end, has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, I quote, lest he put forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. It's really weird. The sentence isn't completed. It's a fragment. The text stops short of spelling out the consequence. If humans, with the knowledge they have acquired, became immortal, they would be not merely, as God noted, like one of us, I take it, but divine. The creation of man and woman from Adam and their experiences in the Garden of Eden make up what we might say a myth in this sense. An understanding of the way things are is presented as an imaginative account of how they came to be. That account begins with an original condition that indicates by negation the essential features that make us human. What we didn't originally have: birth and death, incompleteness and desire, shame and fear, labor and pain, ruler and ruled, the covering over of our natural state by the clothing of the law or convention. In the absence of those features, we would be beast or God. The account of this universal human condition that begins here and is then developed through the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis comes to an end with one more myth of this sort. One more step here, and that's the Tower of Babel, which I think I have on there somewhere. Genesis 11. All humanity made up a kind of whole with one common language. Out of the strength of this unity, they undertook to build a city and tower, reaching into heaven. I mean, it really sounds almost to my ears like a paraphrase again of Aristotle. If this is what they begin to do, God worries, there is no limit to what they will attempt. Let us, he exhorts again, go down and confound their language, so humans will be scattered over the face of the earth. Another central feature of life as we know it, the separation of distinct peoples with different languages, lands, and customs, that's the way things are, is presented as a result of divine punishment for a deed of overstepping human boundaries. Is God threatened by this deed? This one really sounds like Aristophanes' Zeus. I think if anywhere you'd be tempted here to think, this biblical God too is really threatened by this human deed and is responding to it defensively in his own interests. You can't let those humans unify all one big world state and unify them. Or, and you see, that's why I said before that I wonder if God is worried about the solitary atom. But I have an alternative here, or another step, another wrinkle here. Or does God perhaps understand, which human beings don't, that we cannot be human if we don't recognize some limit? Human beings can really only be human if they have an awareness of limits, some limit, and some limit not given by nature. We can do anything by nature. There needs to be limits to make us human. In that case, his thwarting this technological imperial project of the Tower of Babel would be meant to save humanity from self-destruction. And this is something we could come back to. I think it's extremely timely with issues we're thinking about globalization and nations and stuff. Okay, the story of humanity assaulting the heavens and suffering the divine punishment of fragmentation translates onto the political plane the story of the original human being split into man and woman who overstep their divinely given boundaries and are punished by God. I think it's rather remarkable. These two stories frame the Bible's opening account of the universal human condition with a double reverberation of Aristophanes' speech about the fall of human beings from their ancient nature. And I could have mentioned Aristophanes, too, has a political translation of his thing about the Spartans and so on. Okay. Are there differences, we can now ask, between the Platonic and the biblical text that shed light on the issue of Athens versus Jerusalem? It's my concluding section here. And this is more inchoate. I'm kind of wrestling with the problems I'm bringing up here. But I'll just tell you one little biographical thing. When I worked on this for quite a while, I've thought about it for a long time, I got this far, and I thought, wow, this is a cool way to represent Jerusalem, Bible versus philosophy. And then it took me way too long to realize that can't be right, because Aristophanes is not representing philosophy for Plato. So that's what I'm moving on to for the concluding section here. As an account of the relationship of love between two individuals, one difference in the two accounts is immediately obvious, right? Aristophanes not only recognizes three classes of lovers, but he depicts male homosexual love as the highest. Their manliness, manifest in the life of politics, is the very closest fallen human beings come to the ambition of the primordial humans. The biblical account, in contrast, recognizes nothing but the love of man and woman in the service of the family and the people to which the family belongs. That's kind of obvious. I think, obviously everyone sees that. It's been used for a lot of interesting political purposes about gay marriage and other things. But this difference in content is connected with a difference in the plot. There's a story to that subject, the plot through which each narrative unfolds. For Aristophanes, the defiance of divine authority is undertaken by the complete human being out of his sense of self-sufficiency. The splitting of that being into partial ones is the product of divine punishment, and Eros the derivative result. In the biblical narrative, the division of man and woman from the whole human is not a result of punishment, and man's cleaving to his wife is not derivative from some more fundamental human passion. There is divine punishment in response to the overstepping of human boundaries, but in the biblical story, that deed is done by the partial being, the woman, motivated by some sense of incompleteness. The place of that deed of defiance and the sequence of events in the story implies a different motivation. In the Aristophanic tale, the original human beings are moved by their big thoughts, remember, to defy the boundaries separating them from the gods of the city and the constraints of the law. They're motivated by that spirited resistance to authority. If there is a biblical counterpart to those big thoughts, it would seem to be the serpent's seduction, which elicits the woman's resistance to the authority of a jealous God. But, here's my big but, the biblical narrative portrays that motivation intertwined with the woman's attraction to the forbidden fruit, driven by a desire for awareness, a desire for wisdom, which is an awareness of her neediness or incompleteness. Quite the opposite, right? Admittedly, that desire can only be pursued by disobedience to divine command. I don't think there's any question about that. And yet, here's my final wrinkle. I know I've gone like on the third hand now here, but and yet, precisely that action of disobedience is the first step on the path of human beings becoming fully human. So, the desire for wisdom, if in this crucial, if ambiguous role, seems to have no place at all in Aristophanes' account in the Symposium. It comes up only in Socrates' speech on Eros, which he puts into the voice of a fictional character, Diotima. The competition between the Aristophanic and the Socratic accounts of Eros is the Symposium's distinctive representation of what Socrates on one occasion calls, you all know, the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. If Eros, and this might be an interesting problem in itself, why does Eros provide the key to that? But if Eros provides the key, the quarrel between philosopher and poet must turn on the status of the erotic human quest for wisdom. That's actually a suggestion Aristotle makes in the opening chapters of the Metaphysics. I think this is my last passage I have on the handout. I think Aristotle wrote this for my paper. Oh, Aristotle. The context.
You're lucky.
The context is his survey of human opinions about wisdom as the highest or most comprehensive knowledge. Led from there to philosophy, with its starting point in wonder, Aristotle designates it as the only free knowledge, by analogy with the free person who exists for his own sake. But for that reason, Aristotle admits, it might be thought to lie beyond human limits, since human nature is in many ways servile. And he quotes the poet Simonides, quote, God alone would have this privilege. Then Aristotle clicks in. If there were anything to the poet's notion that the divine is naturally jealous, so that's it, right? That's his essential characterization of poetry, the imagining of a jealous God who sets prohibitions on him. That would be aroused above all, Aristotle reasons, by the human striving for knowledge. But for the divine to be jealous is impossible. Hey, the poets tell lies. So Aristotle admits that. So here, this is kind of important. This is my summary of what he's saying. What the philosopher understands as the natural limits of human capacity, they all agree that we're limited. We really don't get wisdom. We get philosophy. But for the philosopher, the explanation of that is nature, the natural limits of the human being. What the philosopher understands that way, the poet construes as a criminal act inviting divine punishment. For the philosopher, that's the erotic striving for knowledge that gives him the human life most worth living. So I think that's the real essence of this understanding of poetry versus philosophy. So I'm going to want to conclude now with, not much of a conclusion, but here's where I've been led. Jerusalem, I used to always think, and I think everyone talks this way, Jerusalem and Athens is a synonym for Bible and philosophy. I've used them, so synonymously that way. But I'm now deciding Jerusalem and Athens as the two roots of the West cannot be simply identified with Bible and philosophy. For Athens, quote, Athens is a type, Athens is internally divided between poetry and philosophy. If Aristotle got it right, the jealous god of the poets represents within Athens the side of the Bible over philosophy. Do you also, I don't want to bother to stand up here, but I'm saying what looks like two separate independent things, Bible versus philosophy, on the let me start again, Jerusalem versus Athens. On the side of Athens is internally divided between poetry and philosophy. And this account of poetry looks like this, what we just said about the Bible. Yet, the Bible, in portraying God's fundamental prohibition, acknowledges the primary status of the desire for wisdom as the challenge to divine authority. Of course, that in turn motivates the task of the Bible, that I think the whole Bible maybe sets out to demonstrate the necessity of divine guidance for that reason. That's the challenge that the Bible, I think, takes up. That's a thought I have. In the case of Athens, on the other hand, philosophy somehow emerges out of the soil of Greek poetry. I mean, certainly Homer is clear to me. Homer is the source of Plato as much as of tragedy and comedy. If the philosopher, at least I'm pretty confident about it in the case of Plato, engages in a quarrel with the poets, it in some way incorporates the other and turns this external relation of two independent sources into the internal structure of a whole. If you followed that last paragraph, that's taken me about 40 years to figure out. So thank you all for your patience. I'm sorry it took so long.
And now our practice is to have a response to the speaker by a graduate student, and this is Jacob Alabapia.
Well, I want to thank Professor Burger for just a tremendous wealth of close readings, and I think it's a lot of fun and sort of a rarity that we get to go so deep into a text. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to apologize to all of you that I have to finish setting up. But I'm going to keep my remarks short. We have a very full house, and we want as many people to talk as get a chance to sort of have a conversation as we can. But this is a fantastic parallel, and I mean, it's such a fantastic parallel that when the rabbis encountered it, they just had to pull Aristophanes in. And if we want a sort of philological history of what was going on, that's sort of coming into view now in Jewish studies, probably through the Nestorian Christian monasteries that were in the sort of Middle East. You have these Christian communities that are carrying on the study of Greek texts. And so the rabbis don't really read Plato, but they probably the greatest hits in the way that the tragedians and Plato become proverbial among Greek speakers. The rabbis have Greek-speaking friends, and they sort of get this. So there are debates over just how much that happens. But
and later, I'm going to ask you for an email.
Yeah, I'll send you an email. So there's a lot going on under the surface in this paper, and I think one of the most interesting, there are these interesting moments where you sort of raise a question textually, and I'm not going to provide any of the answers, so I'll leave that to you guys. I'm instead going to sort of follow the spirit of the end of the paper and focus on a bunch of points where I think we can rearrange the texts in different allegiances with one another, because I think that's where you end up, and that is sort of a very interesting ground for thought. And my way in is going to be a dialectic which you mentioned but wasn't central to the paper, which is between the specific and the general. And this is the question of and the individual love versus, or love for an individual versus sort of love as a general concept. You accuse Aristophanes of not having an account of individual love, he only speaks according to these classes. But one of the, this is also a classic philosophical critique of Plato's account in the Republic, that the Platonic dichotomous ladder of love has the same flaw, which you start with the individual, but immediately you leave him or her behind, and so that's that. So a lot of people read that as a problem. If the specific object sort of commands our erotic allegiance, why should we get beyond that? Haven't we lost something as soon as we try to get beyond that? So if it's a problem for Aristotle, it might be a problem for Plato too. And then what about...
For Diotima.
Diotima, sorry.
If you say Diotima, I totally am happy you said that, and I agree with you entirely.
Diotima, that's what I meant. On the paper, it says Diotima. You can see.
Okay. It is such a problem. It's a worse problem for
It's
her.
the worst problem,
Yeah.
right? So, but then we have to add in the biblical story, and the Bible is, full of, Persönlichkeit, of these characters. But what about Eve? The love story between Adam and Eve is not one of those. So, have we found a similarity shared by all three texts, the biblical account, Aristophanes and Diotima? And we might even trace the tendency into Aristotle. It's not clear that the account of friendship in the Ethics really gets at, what's a friendship? One that has this sort of reciprocal relationship of virtues. Well, I don't know, that's not why I hang out with my friends. I mean, it should be, but it's not.
I think Aristotle agrees with you about that point too, but that would be...
Okay. I'm just I mean, it's okay if all these texts agree, and if this reciprocity merely a structural feature of Eros? Maybe eidetically, people want. All these texts want to get beyond, or think that the key feature of Eros gets beyond the individual. But then where does it leave us with the unique personality? That's an interesting point where Aristophanes, I think, is accepting a premise of Diotima. So the seeming similarity between Aristophanes and Diotima makes me wonder about Aristophanes' privileged role dramatically in the Symposium. After Alcibiades' speech and the descent of the party into chaos, Aristophanes is the only one who still wants to carry on the serious discussion. And he shouts to be heard, and Socrates sort of, conveniently ignores him, and doesn't, that conversation that could have happened doesn't. So one might take this to highlight the unique strength of Aristophanes' argument. His account, so what could those strengths be vis-a-vis Diotima's? His account includes both the political power of Eros, as you mentioned, and the human tragedy of our erotic needs. Socrates' account, on the other hand, I suspect Aristophanes thinks, subsumes both the specificity of politics and the specificity of sexuality in the climb to wisdom. So, you say the Bible and, this is again in the spirit of all these realignings, the Bible and the biblical account and Diotima have this account of wisdom, but I think Aristophanes was shouting, not so fast. This isn't necessarily about wisdom. The specific makes a final claim at the end of the Symposium, both in a sort of opera buffa sense in Alcibiades' specific love for Socrates, but also possibly in a more silent and serious sense. That's Aristophanes' voice. On the other hand, Aristophanes' speech is so clearly tied to a particular political reality, as you mentioned, and a particular gender reality, in a way that Socrates' relationship to Diotima playfully does. So whereas there's a clear hierarchy with the heterostriae, that sort of interesting hopox, at the bottom, and male-male lovers at the top, Socrates immediately is learning something from a woman. So the very political context of Athenian social norms is immediately rejected, but that's again a rejection of the particular context in favor of a non-particular context. In this sense, Socrates and the biblical text play with homoiosis theo, becoming like God, in a way that Aristophanes doesn't dream of. The biblical account is universalistic, is at the beginning of a particularistic text. So you have the creation of the world up until a point, and this is Vico's reading that I'm sort of borrowing, that until the flood, the Bible is completely universalistic, and then after the flood, including the Babel story, that's a particularistic political history. So once again, the biblical text separates out particular and universal in a way that doesn't exactly map onto the Greek story, because you've just picked up one of the only purely universalistic parts of say, the Pentateuch. But that might require a further investigation into the sort of more genetic account of politics in the Bible. So that's the last thing I would like to mention. And here maybe I'm pushing a distinction between philosophy and political philosophy. if Aristophanes is a fully political account, down to the particular privileging of these particular identities, and Socrates is willfully unparticular, I mean, he's learning it from a Peloponnesian, then where does that leave the biblical account of politics, post-Diluvian, particular, and poetic, against the Greek?
Okay, thank you so much. Too much. And I know you have to leave, so do I have time to try to respond a little bit?
Yes.
I want to start with what you started with, because I'm very grateful. I think it helps me sort of clarify some things that were presented too sketchily here. So, first of all, one thing I think I could just state more clearly than I do, I can see where it's sort of misleading. I do think that Aristophanes' speech is the speech. Plato gave the comic poet Aristophanes his deepest understanding of what we want out of erotic love of another individual. I think that, and so what I meant to say, rather that he ends up just talking about typology of three classes, what I really meant to say is, he's telling us what our illusion may be, or what our desire at least is of Eros for another individual, perhaps our illusion, and suggesting that it's never fulfilled, and then what you're left with is sexual orientation of three classes. But I absolutely want to, give him, this Platonic Aristophanes, total credit for the deepest understanding of individuality of any passage in Plato that I'm aware of. So on the one hand. Then let's go to Diotima. I think I have a very, more extreme than most readers of Plato, very big gap between even Socrates and Diotima, let alone Diotima and Plato. Okay, I do, and so I have a footnote here, but the footnote is much more important than just a footnote. The other thing that dawned on me, the other thing that really dawned on me is when I realized, Aristophanes, it's so complicated. You need a book for this, right? Aristophanes can't represent poetry as such. There's also the tragic poet, Agathon, and then the end of the night is that the same poet who wrote by art would be able to write tragedy and comedy. And is that Plato? Or it is Plato for sure, but I think it's also Aristophanes that Plato's. Okay, so Aristophanes can't simply represent poetry as such, but much worse, Diotima can't represent philosophy. That's not philosophy. I don't know what it is. It's a ritual initiation into the mysteries. And at a crucial moment, Socrates calls her the perfect sophist. That's that speech is so interesting to do carefully, like the structure of it, and what, just rough for the moment. I think that, her opening myth about poverty and plenty got united and generated Eros, and Eros is really, to jump to the conclusion, an awareness of lack and the resourcefulness to figure out. That, I think, is where Socrates is with her, but not after that. I believe when he starts asking her the questions, and Eros becomes productive and so on. But where I want to really thank you for what you said, because it's so important, is she doesn't retain individuality whatsoever, and I also think she loses Eros. Others than I have noted this too, that famous ladder of love, right? First of all, I don't know, so many students tell me, I tell them how much they like the Aristophanes speech and they like the Diotima speech. But I've never been drawn, it's crazy. She goes, love the ascent. First you love one beautiful body, then you love many beautiful bodies. No, that's not love. And then maybe you go to the soul, and the whole thing makes very little sense, I think. But what happens is, as she ascends, contemplation or theoria become. Okay, let me start again. This is maybe more important to say. Another thing I could have said about the difference between Aristophanes and Diotima, the horizontal versus the aspirational. The beautiful plays no role in Aristophanes' account. And I'm not going to go into how Agathon brings it in, but for Diotima, obviously the beautiful takes over, and contemplation takes over. And that's the aspirational ascent aspect of the speech she gives, but it's just absolutely explicit on the surface. Eros drops out. By the end, she is no longer even speaking of Eros. And until the last remark she makes to Socrates, Socrates, you spend so much attention and energy wanting to see and be together with beautiful boys, if you could see and be together with the beautiful itself, your whole life would be, you would really know what life is worth living or something. But anyway, I want to say that Plato, I'm sure, is aware that whatever is difficult, what Diotima represents, and she does start out introducing philosophy as Eros of wisdom. So I was very superficial there, just sort of pulling that from her speech. And maybe if you understand the speech adequately in the context of the whole symposium, you also know what the Socratic or Platonic view would be. But from her speech, you're absolutely right. She's lost Eros and she's lost individuality. Now, one last thing about Adam and Eve on this issue. I think took me a while. I think it's so interesting that Adam and Eve don't even get, well, Eve at least. And Adam, really, I'm not clear it should be understood as a proper name. Maybe by the time that Eve is a name, his is a name. But I read at least Genesis, the book of Genesis, as an amazingly concrete and rich account of family life. I still don't understand what Genesis is all about, right? Why are there 4 generations? You didn't need 4 generations. But I would say, I said this to people yesterday, the Bible really should start with, Exodus and the revelation of God and the law. But you get 4 generations of family and very rich and very realistic accounts of especially relations between husband and wife and siblings. So the family drama, right? And so my reading of Genesis is Adam and Eve are really just man and woman as such. So I agree with you in a way, right? Deliberately, like archetypal, man and woman as such. And then you get so many interesting reverberations, like Mr. Wilford knows. I tried to write on how the particular women in Genesis are sort of carrying out in actual concrete stories about life these points we've been making about the first woman here. But yeah, so I agree with you. They're like meant to be the archetypes. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And tell me, I would love to know those references. Yeah.
Let's hope we have more questions so we can have more answers. Who's next?
That's great, Ronna, thanks. So, in the image of God, did he create it? Male and female, did he create them? And doesn't one want a way of referring to humankind generally as one kind of being, and then also to differentiation of the two sexes as two kinds of beings? It makes sense that there'd be an it into them, and of course, and can mean the human being more broadly. I guess so. Do we need sexual hermaphroditism to explain this? And I'm impressed that some of the rabbinic commentators kind of went with that. I guess that's what Jacob could be suggesting. It's possible they were already aware of Aristophanes and that, and might help draw them in this direction. I was very impressed by that, but I wasn't quite sure I was.
Yeah. They make it almost. No, I know. They make it almost more corporeal, And I noticed in Philo, I don't know Philo well, and I don't. But anyway, I saw a couple different translations. But when he I think it's in that. He refers to the passage, and I'm not sure the translation I ended up using, but it seems like in 2 different ways. At one point, he speaks about Genesis 1 representing the creation of the species. He has 2 different formulas, which I don't know if he thought they were identical. I don't think they are. The creation of the species or the creation of the ideal human. And if it's the creation of the species, your point just is correct, right? There's the species, and then no individual member of the class of human beings is simply human being. We're all man and woman. I know in the modern world we're like 100 other variations, but if we keep it simple for the moment, we're man and woman, and then there's human species, right? But he also does refer to, at some points in his commentary, to the ideal human being. And I don't know if we need to, I like your point, I don't know if we need to think of this in such physical, corporeal terms or anything. I really like Maimonides' suggestion. And Maimonides is making everything up. It's not meant to be accurate. But in this case, I think he might be getting at a possible intention of the biblical author that the human being as mind in some way does transcend male and female. Right? It's something, mind is... yeah. So, yeah. Do you want to?
Yeah.
So I have a kind of a shot in the dark suggestion and a question. With regard to the animal skins,
Yeah.
When I've read that before, I've thought, is this some sort of implication of a sacrifice was needed? That, I mean, I don't know if it's weird to think about God sacrificing animals, but
It's weird, but it's...
that there might be, that there would have to be death involved. I mean, you could shear a sheep, but these are skins, so.
Yeah.
And the question is, with regard to, you brought up a lot, the relationship between the female and the desire for wisdom. It's just kind of all over these stories. And I'd never noticed before how it's Eve who says, I want this because I want to be wise, and then it doesn't seem like, I mean, Adam's just sort of following along. So this notion that the desire for wisdom is rechanneled into serving the man, I thought that was wonderful. But I'm curious then, of course, Diotima isn't necessarily a philosopher, but she's on the religious spectrum probably more of a philosopher than Aristophanes' religiosity would be. So she's wanting wisdom in some respect. She's presented positively for that. Eve is presented negatively. Aristophanes presents women as hardly having minds at all. So I'm not sure what my question is, but is this a strict philosophy versus religion take on the female relationship to wisdom?
Okay, let me start with your, and then work backward. So I think that one way you might put what is wrong with Diotima as Plato's representative of the philosopher is, it is too much of a claim to the possession or fulfillment of wisdom. And her speech in a certain way, I think, is incoherent, unless you think this latter thing makes it all fall together. But in a way, it's incoherent. Her initial thing is that philosophy is really represented by poverty, aware of needing resource, right? And philosophy is knowledge of ignorance. And that's why it's Eros. The only way you can get Eros, the only way you can get the fundamental manifestation of Eros to be philosophy is if you understand philosophy not to be wisdom, but really put so much emphasis on desire for wisdom. And that's where Diotima does not end up, right? She ends up with this contemplative contemplation of the beautiful. And so...
You mean the achievement of wisdom?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's wrong there. In the case of Eve, or woman, what's interesting to me is just how profoundly ambiguous the evaluation is, I think, by the biblical authors. I don't know, I used to be very much more careful about not ascribing my crazy readings to the intention of the authors of the Bible, but I've gotten bold. I think I'm on their wavelength sometimes. So I think that the thing with the ambiguity is so profound. Yes, it is presented as the crime, the fundamental crime, right? And everything in human life now becomes a matter of punishment for it. And she did it, right? She initiated it. Her husband followed along. So that's all true, but, and this is a huge but, could the biblical God, could the authors of this story really have meant that God's plan for humanity was to be too childlike or almost animal-like, childlike innocence, forever? It just seems completely crazy. They're trying to understand human life and the human condition. They have to get human beings out of the Garden of Eden. And this is what does it. So that's what I mean by the profound ambiguity, that the Bible is admitting, the biblical authors of Genesis are admitting that this deed of disobedience, this is where I'm in trouble with a lot of my Straussian friends who want to pit reason against revelation, and revelation means obedience to divine command. I think this story, the teaching is, what I'm concluding from it is, you absolutely need some kind of disobedience of divine command in order to, let me start again. The possession of knowledge of good and evil, obviously they don't know anything. They leave the garden, right? It has to mean the potential for that. That now human beings have the potential to know good and evil. They've acquired that faculty. And I want to say that's got to be God's plan, according to the biblical, whatever they might mean by God. That's got to be the plan, because otherwise we won't understand anything about human life from this story. So, yeah, does that sort of getting
Yeah,
started.
so Eve is committing this great crime, but it's this great act of nobility in another sense.
It's the crucial, greatest benefaction on the human race, because it's what takes us out of this childlike innocence, sets us on the path of becoming human. But you notice I had in my last paragraph, I pulled back. I don't know, I'm like courage and moderation, but I'm pretty courageous, but I did. I pulled back a little and I go, on the other hand, perhaps it is true. That's what I meant by saying, now the Bible really has a challenge. It's admitted that this is the difficulty, right? The human desire for autonomous and independent knowledge. That's what really is, has to be dealt with. And so the Bible is the whole Bible must be, I assume, ultimately the biggest mission of the Hebrew Bible must be, how do you yoke that to some kind of divine guidance or, something along those lines?
Thank you.
Professor Stein.
Yeah, I have a question about, it's just a detail in the paper, but I think it's a pretty important one. And it's on the Aristophanes side of things. You say that according to Aristophanes, that Eros isn't a primary human passion, that it's derivative from something. In the story, it's derivative from the punishment. And that's what you say that, but that's surely allegorical for something else. So what is it allegorical for? What does that punishment mean really? What's he trying to capture? What's the truth of the matter in Aristophanes' view?
Yeah.
That's an image of.
Okay, so I guess I would think of 3 steps maybe in this story. And the first one is pretty much explicit, right? That the primary thing of these primary beings. So, okay, you do an imaginative genetic account. You try to imagine to explain the way things are, how can I go backwards, trace backwards, and start with a state that's different in kind? And that is trying to capture something primary, which I gather, I'm not sure how to put it. At one point I put it the desire not to be ruled, or the desire to be free, or the desire to not live under the yoke of authority. By the way, I have another wrinkle on it as I'm looking at you, Jeff, and I'm getting another idea here, but let me start with that. So that, I think, is that's what I had in mind, at least, as the primary human impulse, according to Aristophanes. And it certainly seems to fit with this idea that the highest human life of fallen human beings is the political life, and that they come the closest to that aspiration of the spiritedness, or Harvey calls it assertiveness, I think. Something like that. So I think that might be the primary thing. And then we have to figure out what is the punishment, and then Eros will be driven. I mean, is the punishment, this is where I did go backwards again when I said, where did I come up with this formula about marriage? Eros has to be antinomian. Eros has to be a passion that is not in harmony with law and convention. So working backwards, I come to the conclusion that the punishment is, and I think Strauss has this is not me really, but not me alone, that the punishment of the splitting in half is somehow representing the imposition of law or convention on the human condition.
And then Eros is the resistance to that punishment, the wish that it hadn't occurred and then trying to overcome it, or is something else that's created by under the influence of law? Yeah.
I mean, I have a couple thoughts about that. One is, you're actually making me, think this through a little more carefully, I think. I don't want to say, this is the danger, I don't want to say that Eros is motivated by hatred of the constraints of the law or trying to overthrow the chain and yoke of the law. That's the most, and that would not be Eros. Eros is positive, and the positive is the desire for the wholeness or some kind of completeness or wholeness, at least as Aristophanes understands it, which I think, and so I don't know if one should go any further than this than to say that the effects of this imposition of law or convention are a kind of alienation of human beings from their nature, a kind of fragmentation or cutting down to size of human beings. So I'm leaving you, I guess what I'm leaving with at the moment there are a lot, we can talk about this maybe some more, later, but I think what I'm leaving you with is, I want to admit, this is maybe a thin line, I want to admit that Eros is antinomian. It can't, this is why he's worried about marriage, right? That Eros can't be yoked. This is why he elevates homosexual love. Eros can't be yoked or subordinated to the needs of family and society. You've lost something, at least according to Aristophanes, of Eros. So I want to say that. Yet I want to refrain from saying that it is nothing but a passion determined by rejecting the law. That's not the aim of it. That's the most. That is the most. They're very close, right? They're very close. I don't know, does that get us started at least? I know we can go on from there.
No, Dan.
A question about Aristophanes and a final question. About Aristophanes, it seems like his underlying theme is the savagery of the gods, and to make us more humane, we have to be freed from the gods. And the way you put it was one of the underlying theme of the Bible is to teach us in a way the need for divine guidance. That seems very close. So I want to push on their opposition to that. People are very, very close. And one of the oppositions strikes me is that Aristophanes is replaceable with Eryximachus, which means it's on the basis of natural philosophy, which means he has some knowledge of nature, and in light of which conventions can't withstand logos. And so the sacred, especially the sacred behind incest taboo, can't withstand logos, and that's something the city can't tolerate. That in astronomy, I would call. And Aristophanes thinks those are connected in an interesting way. But you didn't emphasize, but I think you could in reading of Genesis. So do you think that the authors of Genesis were also aware of this distinction? Because sometimes you suggest they were, like in your reading of Arum and Arumim, or the clothing versus being naked, reading it as a becoming aware of the need for conventions. But the authors of Genesis post-philosophy in the way that you're suggesting.
So wait, are you asking whether the authors of Genesis are aware of nature versus convention?
Well, because it seems like that's a crucial underlying premise for Aristophanes.
Yeah.
And the reflection on is which conventions do we really need as necessities, how to justify them if they can't be justified by speech in light of knowledge of nature. In fact, you use this formula, humans need a limit not given by nature. I mean, that sounds like it summarizes Aristophanes as well. So
Yeah.
any single sentence I can. So what, I guess what that made me wonder, in your reading of the authors of Genesis, something like poets in the Aristophanic or Platonic sense, meaning writing a story, inventing a poem, which tries to sanctify beyond logos, in awareness of the difference between knowing and truth is, those conventions, especially around family, that are somehow necessary for city and other kind of politics and other kinds of things to learn.
Yeah. I have two ideas that are probably incompatible. The first one is, it is really, I didn't bring this in because I'm not quite sure I understand fully how it all works, but it's so striking that Aristophanes ends his speech by saying, he ends his speech, the main thing he says is, we're not going to get what we want out of Eros, but the next best is to find a favor to our taste or something like that. There's a kind of, compensation. So that's like, and he goes, as long as we are observe piety toward the gods. His speech is so remarkable, and this goes back to the question about Diotima, theologically too. I mean, she's denied that Eros is a god, or Socrates speaking through her. And she doesn't have any gods in the end. I mean, she does have the beautiful idea, the beautiful or something like that, but it totally replaces any kind of theology or personal gods or gods with will in Diotima. Whereas Aristophanes ends with piety, the need for piety toward the gods, and that threat of Zeus. Otherwise, we're going to be hopping around on one foot. He's inducing fear, exhorting to piety. It's really kind of remarkable. You'd think this tough guy would. So I would say, on the one hand, that maybe is part of, I think it is part of Plato's idea of this Plato's understanding of poetry versus philosophy. That the poets, whether as rhetoric or ironic or esoteric readings or not, the poets are more connected to the political world, to the city, and cannot get independent of the city to to the extent that the philosopher can. And so the poet, in a way, as crazy as his speech is, if you read it really, under the surface, he has to end with piety. And it's a kind of service to the city. So, yeah, that's poetry. That's one half. I wanted to also say, which might not be harmonious with that, I actually think that Paul Wilford does this. I do make the argument. I don't agree with people who say the Bible has no conception of nature versus convention. I don't think you can understand a lot of the certainly Genesis. I don't think you can understand those stories other than reflections on the difference between nature and Genesis. And I would, offer as my most simple, obvious, two obvious examples. One is that the woman is supposed to be subordinate to the man. That's the convention that we just learned here. And none of the women in the Genesis families are subordinate to the man. And they're not, and they're naturally right not to be. They're running the show in all those family problems. So that's one. And then equal to that is the primogeniture issue. According to law, the firstborn should inherit the birthright. It never works. Every story is a story about the appropriate nature is not the one that convention says. So how could they not be aware of the natural order? At least, yeah.
So it seems, according to you, the feminists should read the Bible.
I'll tell you it's interesting where I've gotten into trouble.
Well, I was just going to ask, what reflections do you have on feminism?
What's interesting and where I've gotten into trouble is, I think that at least let's talk about Genesis, because that's all these women and families and everything. In the book of Genesis, the conventional structure is subordination of woman to man, the rule of the husband in the household. And my claim is that all of those stories are showing you how clever and how devious and how indirect these women have to be if they are the naturally right ruler over against their conventional subordination. And especially like young women students, they don't like that. And I discovered this, it was a similar case I was commenting on a paper on Penelope in the Odyssey. And this student had a beautiful, as long as she stuck with the text, a beautiful description of how powerful Penelope is. She knows who this man is. She's controlling the whole show. She, is running has been doing this for 20 years. She's been running this, big estate, and she's doing it all. But so indirectly. And the woman's paper was entitled "The Trophy Wife." Penelope, the trophy wife. She didn't like that Penelope has to subordinate herself to the guardians and so. She didn't put together these two things. So, here's my response to the feminists. I would say there are many circumstances in life where you wouldn't wish for those conditions, but actually some interesting things flower and flourish under those conditions. And I think where I got this idea from is the most interesting part. I started thinking about what Strauss says about esoteric writing, that we don't wish for circumstances of persecution, of course, and we want freedom of speech and so on. But actually, under those circumstances, it enables something to flourish that can otherwise be lost, which is the proper way to transmit philosophy and make the reader think for himself and so on. Only under these bad circumstances. And then I thought, that's a lot like what I think certain ancient accounts of the woman question amounts to. Does that make sense?
Yes. Rory.
Thanks for your paper. Just a quick note on the naked.
Yeah.
So it's, what is it? It's 3 letters. So the vowels are different.
Yeah.
So that leads me to think it's just like wordplay of scribes. That they voweled the consonants different in that passage than all the other. I guess normally the word for naked was Aaron. So I don't know how much it's wordplay, like kind of obvious wordplay. If you have to play with it though, I guess I'd say, well, if you're naked, you'd be ashamed, except if you're Eve. So she's the last shameless naked person, and the serpent is shameless because cunning.
Right.
So I don't know how long you want to go with that. But,
I like that. Yeah.
But on the more substantive point is that, so you're trying to do parallel the Aristophanes' speech in Genesis 2. So the commonality is rebellion. You see the difference. The difference is that it looks like male and female is not punishment, but sort of a fix in the Bible, and it's punishment. And so there's the difference. And the similarity is supposed to be rebellion, and then something maybe search for wisdom. But for me, Genesis 2, it's hard to say that Eve man has a natural desire for wisdom, because it seems like the serpent, who I think is just very telegraphed, is God. God sends the serpent. That's, by the way, also the blasphemous sort of denial of original sin argument. Well, the serpent is God, so it's not sin. But the serpent is the one who introduces the idea of good and evil being part of the tree there. And I think in the passage when Eve said, and it says, well, Eve saw was good food and nice to look at and good knowledge of good and evil. That's after the serpent said,
True.
oh, you won't die. So the serpent educates Eve about this very idea that she could gain this third thing besides just beautiful, delicious fruit. So then you could say that it's really God and God's creatures under his control, God's control, that educate Eve. That the origin of wisdom is this trick, sort of, but it also proves the need for authority, because the trick leads to sin. So that Eve has no natural desire for wisdom. She doesn't have any awareness of lacking. There is no lacking. That's the serpent. And then that would be, I don't know what the next step, I don't know, but that's just what occurs to me, that it's hard to see. You'd like to make her heroic, searching for wisdom, and it'd be good for the feminist point of view too, but it just looks like they're content. They're content and naked and stupid, a little bit like maybe what Rousseau's early people.
So, there are a lot of things one could say. Just a very general point, I'm really interested, if I pursue these crazy Bible readings, I'm really interested in the general question of how the way I think about it is, all these biblical stories and narratives there's like two planes at work, right? There's some kind of divine plan that's operating behind the backs of the human agents. That's how I see it. And I think that's very deliberate, because the human beings have to make their choices and show their psychology and their relationships and so on in full ignorance of any kind of greater destiny or plan. And yet maybe there is a divine plan operating behind the scenes. Sometimes you hear that, sometimes you don't. So I'm really interested in the way those two planes sort of intersect or don't throughout a lot of the Bible. I would say from Genesis to the end of Kings, that's what I'm interested in. And you're saying this is the first story of that sort, right? I think it would be hard to you could never give a knockdown refutation of what you just said. It's very interesting reading that the serpent is God's creation, and this is giving her the idea, and so on. I think if I tried to think about that, I would say something like, first of all, I'm not sure I really like the suggestion I made that the serpent is representing a kind of inner dialogue within Eve, but it's also a really tempting reading. Cassuto has that reading that there's a he calls it a duologue. I mean, there's some reason that the biblical authors sort of put this serpent only in contact with Eve in this conversation. There's some kind of conversation. The other thing I thought of, this is really remote, but I think it convinces me. When Plato is discussing spiritedness, you remember he has this idea that one of the signs of it is spiritedness personifies. Spiritedness takes some force that's within your own psychology and presents it as if it were an other. It projects it like, it's so natural almost a reading of the serpent, right? The spiritedness of the serpent. So, I don't know. Could be God. At least I like the idea that it is God's plan to get them out of the Garden of Eden. So that sort of makes sense to me. But I'm also tempted to, and I also go along with you that you're absolutely right. The serpent's conversation is the first thing that moves her or motivates her. But I'm still somewhat attracted to the idea that she is not reducible to what that serpent represents. He gets her going, But, okay, one last thing. The moderate thing to say about all this is there's some motivation to become like God, whether it's like the serpent's view of it or the way I'm pushing this philosophic idea. That's so, I don't think that could be proven.
There's no witnesses in the garden. So the revelation is a teaching of good and evil. So that it's like the original lesson in the garden is in a way less important than the lesson of the Bible delivered by Moses or whatever.
Absolutely, yes.
So that's
yes. And the other way I thought about it is this is man and woman as such, and they don't come out with any knowledge, right? This has to be some idea of like the faculty human beings have to know good and evil. That is what they've acquired according to this genetic account. But you also see I'm translating every genetic story into this eidetic story.
Manuel.
Hi, Ronna.
Hey!
See you again. Wondering how far you would go, and I know this hasn't been your focus, but how far you would go in your criticism of Diotima, the only woman we know of who's refuted Socrates, so she's an interesting case. It seems to me aspects of what she says do seem to me to represent love, of course, and to represent also what Plato actually believes. One thing I would say is the thing missing from Aristophanes' speech, beauty. It seems beauty is a kind of experience of imagining something that isn't really there. It's Beauty's experience of being swept by something that's fundamentally an illusion, a lie. But it's an illusion, imagination of God, of something divine, angelic, perfect. And that sense that underlines the fact that Eros is something one can never have. So in a way, her speech is much harsher, as I think you indicate, than Aristophanes' speech. Second, it seems to jibe some remarks of Plato where he says, essentially, what is man that you should love him so much? And that man is not the center of the universe. Or maybe the universe is at the center of some men, philosophers, but that poetry is a distortion by making our longings seem like they govern the whole, and then a distortion of what one most want. Third, I would say Diotima brings out this thing that seems to me connected to love, which is children. But once you say children, aren't you saying that that's not simply love of the other as the other, but love of the other as connected with immortality or the hope of immortality, which is not present in them. And so I just kind of push in different ways how far you
I think I like all of those features you're bringing. Yeah, I think that especially I guess one might say, I've said this before, it might be right, that the Diotima speech is the locus classicus in all of Plato for this most important issue of the relation between the beautiful and the good. That's maybe the most central question of Platonic thinking. What's the relation between the beautiful and the good? And if you ask where to look for that, it's everywhere in a way, but it's especially thematic in Diotima's speech. So, I want to go along with you that that's a real contribution she's made. And, also the way immortality has been brought in as some kind of in connection with the beautiful, right? This end or aim, this illusion, and how do we get it? And what's the most satisfactory way to it, and so on. So here's what I really think. And maybe because I don't feel that I have certainly not mastered this Diotima speech, and I have such an attraction to the Aristotle. But here's what I really think. I started to think about. I have to bring the Phaedrus into this story too, because I was thinking when I thought about the reciprocity issue. Aristophanes, no problem of reciprocity. The two lovers are each beloved and loved. Diotima, but there's no assent. Diotima has some kind of assent that starts with Eros, at least, some kind of assent. Although I think she loses Eros at the end. But the issue of reciprocity never comes up. Sort of interesting. I don't believe it ever comes up. She's not really thinking about, our longing to have the beloved love us back. And then I thought, what is Plato doing here? And it strikes me that I don't think I ever thought of it this way. The theme of the there's one more account of Eros, right? The Phaedrus. The theme of the whole Phaedrus, I think now, the core is really about reciprocity. It's really about what you love. When you love another individual, you want the individual to love you back. And that's what the whole Phaedrus. So here's just one point. If I were to look for a place in Plato where I get the coincidence I think that we want, although it too needs interpretation, Socrates' big mythic hymn in the Phaedrus, his last speech in the Phaedrus, is about, more than any of either Aristophanes or Diotima, is about how love for another individual could be connected in some mysterious way with an ascent to the, search for wisdom or the vision of the ideas or something like that. That's the one place where those two things are really held together. And I don't know if anyone in the Symposium has that. It's kind of, that's an aside, but I should have known that a long time ago in life. I just came up with that in the last couple of weeks thinking about this. Yeah.
So if we accept the notion that divine transgression lies at the heart of humanity, how do we now interpret the claim by Socrates that philosophy is true piety?
Yeah. And this, you might not like this, I'm inclined to start an answer from the Bible side. It's, in a way I think it captures it. When I said at the end that this disobedience of God's command in the Bible is the way, is the starting point toward becoming human. And however the Bible's going to bring that under the yoke of piety, it had to start that way. And I think the Bible really elevates individuals. A lot of people disagree with me. Elevates individuals who negotiate with God.
I won't report you.
Don't tell the authorities. Who sort of put God to their own standard. So Socrates is just the purest version of that, right? I mean, take the oracle, right? His answer to the oracle in the Apology. He says, well, it's got to be a God. It can't be. The oracle says this is the wisest human being, or no human being is wiser than Socrates. And Socrates says, that's the speech of a God. That can't be false. No, that's piety, right? No God would speak falsehood. So, I better refute it. I better go around just like any other opinion I hear. He starts to then examine everyone to try to find out what it means. So, in the Socratic case, I think the serious answer I would give to your question is, in Plato's hands, these claims, we are meant to carry on the life of examination that Socrates started. We are supposed to be examining or questioning any answer we're given, these opinions. And that is in Socrates' words, that's the human wisdom that he regards as the true piety. It might be a little too smoothed over, but I think that's more or less the way Plato's thinking.
Yes.
So just following up, wouldn't that be a defense of saying that you are supporting Aristophanes' position here? And what I mean by that is he ends with piety, right?
Yeah.
That's what we need.
Yeah.
How does he get there? But he gets there from our original nature being one that thinks high thoughts, thinks these great thoughts. And I don't think it's so much that our great thoughts are, I want to overthrow Zeus in order to rule. It's that we circle beings are higher than these would-be gods, right? We are in the image of the cosmic gods themselves, more perfect than these projections of a single-sex individual, right? And so the high thoughts are a refutation, to use your word from Socrates' oracle story there. But Aristophanes says, the problem isn't that these circle guys were disobedient, that they were disobeying the law. There was no law, as you pointed out. It's that they were wrong. They really weren't as high. We weren't as high. We aren't as high as these philosophic thoughts would take you. And in fact, recognizing our nature, recognizing convention, is part of a wisdom that encompasses recognizing that maybe you don't have the refutation of the gods, and that further attempts may even dissolve you further. So that Aristophanes in this speech anticipates what we call Socrates' assent or philosophy, and says, no, that's in fact highly destructive, and a more thoughtful, reasoned account would lead you to piety, just as you were saying right there.
Yeah. Okay, I have a kind of hunch about this, I would say, and that is, in a couple ways you could put this. One is, you're making me think now, I don't think I saw this quite so much of a pattern or so systematic. There's so many things in Aristophanes' speech, like words or formulae, that could be given a perfect Platonic reading and would exactly reflect what I believe the Socratic view would be, the Socratic philosophy's view would be. That Eros is the desire and pursuit of the whole, that we think big thoughts, that we have something that transcends what the Olympian gods represent. All of those things could be given a Platonic reading. But I would still probably want to stick to the suggestion that Plato doesn't have Aristophanes understanding those words that way. That there is some kind of division between the Aristophanic understanding of these things and what would be a truly Platonic understanding. And maybe the way I would answer you, the way you put it at the end, would be something like, they might both agree that we don't possess, they do agree that we don't possess wisdom, and that we aren't divine, and that we are, at most, have human wisdom. But what human wisdom means for Socrates is not giving up on the pursuit of wisdom as the one thing that makes life most worth living. And I'm not sure, I wouldn't claim, I don't know, have enough of a feel for Aristophanes myself, but I don't think that's, at least the Aristophanes Plato presents here, I don't think that's what he thinks by it. So there can be agreement that we are limited, but how that's understood. And if that's why I think that Aristotle passage is so interesting. If that Aristotle passage really captures something essential about the poets, and Aristophanes represents that, you kind of wonder, does he have that kind of understanding of human limits?
Right. It's not something to be dismissed. The Aristophanes' position is not just to say, well, he's a poet, he tells lies, right?
Right.
In fact, he could have seen something that Socrates didn't see, and is
that I'm not sure I want to agree with.
In line with the clouds, correcting him.
Yeah. Okay, so that's a big
That's
question.
the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we get enough from the Symposium, by the way, to address that question. Since Socrates doesn't speak. Unless you could get it out of his exchange with Agathon. I don't know about that.
Yeah, Ronna, you mentioned that Maimonides, by leaving out the third feature of the tree, draws attention to that very feature that wisdom is the human attempt to rebel against divine authority. But you left out what seems to me to be the most striking thing in that chapter, is that Maimonides says, well, initially man being made in God's image means man was intellect, and the fall of this whole account is one of demotion, because knowledge of good and evil isn't knowledge. It has nothing to do with knowledge. Knowledge is about what's true and what's false. Knowledge is about the things that are necessarily the way they are. But what he says, seeing that you're naked, you say, well, that's bad. You don't say, this is false. This has nothing to do with the truth. So what do you make of this whole account? This interpretation that, what you say is a rebellion against divine authority is, I think, in Maimonides' reading, he's putting the finger on the fact that maybe the biblical understanding of what wisdom is not wisdom at all, or of what knowledge is not knowledge at all. I mean, I'm just quoting Maimonides here. I'm not being impious.
Yeah. Blame it on that guy.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't know if you know this or not, but that's the one chapter of the guide that I've really thought about. I think I understand.
That's great.
And here's my understanding of it, which I don't think has convinced anyone, but I think, so on the surface, you stated it absolutely perfectly, right? That his point is, and that's why he needs to keep it to good for food, good to eat, and a delight to the eyes. So his argument on the surface is, man is created by God, was pure mind, and that was seeing everything in life in terms of truth and falsehood, and that was human perfection. But then the desires of the imagination and the desires of the flesh led human beings to get this fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And now we see everything in terms of, and I've gotten it from my Arabic scholars that this is the right way to put it, noble and base, or beautiful and ugly. So the fall, according to Maimonides, insofar as it's a fall, is from subspecia aeternitatis, seeing everything in terms of truth and falsehood, to convention, the shameful things, the generally accepted opinions about what's shameful and noble. And that is a fall. And I read one scholar says, this is the most extreme case anyone has ever stated of demoting convention, from truth and separating the two. Okay, so here comes my Burger's reading, is that Maimonides is aware that good and evil or good and bad, I would first of all translate it, really, I didn't do it in the paper, good and bad. Evil, I don't know, what is evil? But I think it's fine to translate this knowledge of...
You mean moral terms, good and evil clearly are moral terms.
Right, so I would leave, it's just... I mean, I don't know, I wish Hebrew scholars might correct me here, but it really is just the terms for good and bad. It could include, of course, the moral bad, but in any case. My understanding of Maimonides is that beneath the surface, what he's arguing is, what he's indicating is that where do you put good and bad into that dichotomy? Good and bad are not simply, like the example he gives of truth and falsehood is, the diameter of the sun or something like that, it's true or false. That's different, doesn't fit in there.